Good morning, North Harbor. We find ourselves in Acts chapter 5 this morning. And just as a short recap, there's a theme that we've been seeing in the book of Acts that the author has been laying out for us, Luke, the author. And that is that this new community of Christians that we see in the book of Acts, the earliest record of the church and all of its comings and goings and what it does, how it functions. Luke is trying to make the point that this community, there is a shift from God's activity in the temple to the new community. So the new community is the temple. The new community is the place where people come to experience the presence of God. And we see this step by step all the way from the beginning. So in the very beginning, in chapter 2, where you have the outpouring of the Spirit and people speaking in tongues and other languages, proclaiming the good news that Jesus is resurrected. It's accompanied by these phenomenon like the flames of fire over their heads and the sound of a rushing wind. Those sort of phenomenon is pretty common in the Old Testament. When God shows up, that's what happens. So it's Luke is telling us that the presence of God is being poured out on this community. And what that's saying is that the community is the temple. And then in the next chapter, Acts chapter 3, we see Peter heal someone right outside the temple gates. Healing and restoration and rescue and deliverance, both physically, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. These are hallmarks of God's activity. And so we're seeing in practical terms that God is on the move and he's pouring out his Spirit into this community. And the community itself is the temple, the dwelling place of God. And then we saw last week in Acts chapter 4 that the authorities of the temple, the actual temple in Jerusalem, were not happy by this. They feel a bit threatened because the community is gaining a lot of popularity. No surprise there. But they come out and try and arrest them and try to keep them from speaking. And the disciples say, hey, we can't stop talking about this, right? And so, the church is not, just a happy, healthy, wholesome community of like-minded people. It's sacred space where celebration and the worship of God is central, and it's where God's care for God's people is experienced. And what we're seeing here is it experienced in very tangible ways. Peter actually heals someone. That person is restored physically and socially and back into the community. And so, we've seen threats. We've seen that the authorities are getting upset with this community, and they're trying to stamp it out. And so you have pressure from the outside on this community. We're going to see that grow. We're going to see that continue in the next passage, which we're not going to cover this morning. And then we're going to see it really come to a head in Acts chapter 7, where the temple authorities get really upset and things become violent at that point. But what's interesting with a community like this is that, and I've seen this with our own church and many churches and other groups, other community groups as well, that when you feel pressure from outside, the community has this tendency to bond together. It can really strengthen the movement and the community. And we see that in the book of Acts, that this community just keeps on growing. Jesus said, start in Jerusalem, go to Judea, Samaria, the ends of the world, take this message, and that's where this whole narrative is going to go. That's where Luke is going to take us along that journey, starting in Jerusalem, and that's where we're at now, at the temple. And so when there's external pressure, when there's external need, when there's something we need done, the community faces a trial. Oftentimes, when those trials are external, it can really form this community and bring them together and strengthen them. And that's a beautiful thing to see. We've seen it practically in our own experience with church, I'm sure. We see it here in the book of Acts. But we come to an interesting story this morning. And here we see that there is a threat from inside the church. There's a threat going on inside the church. And when that happens, it can derail the whole thing. It's almost a much more sinister threat than anything that people can throw at us from outside. And so we have pressure building from outside of the church, and here we're going to see pressure or trials or hurdles, if you will, come from inside the community. That this is not a perfect community. We're all sinful, flawed human beings, and that poses a threat to the church. And we're going to see a number more of these stories as the book progresses. I'm thinking also, into the next chapter, chapter 6, we're going to see internal problems with this movement, with this community, and how does God's Spirit lead to overcome. And so we have this morning, I'm just going to be honest, this is one of the most shocking and one of the most disturbing stories we find in the New Testament, in the whole New Testament. This is one of those where you just you just wish it wasn't in there. This is one where if you're bringing a friend to church, you're like, I hope the pastor isn't teaching on this. But this is the story that comes up, and it has some very important lessons for us. And Luke puts it in there for a reason. Luke didn't have to put this story in there, but he considered it very important and made it a part of the early church account and for us to read and to learn from. And so that's what we're going to do. And so this is, we're going to start with Acts chapter 2. We have another, this is one of those unfortunate chapter breaks. The chapter should probably start, a new chapter should start in Acts chapter 4, verses 32. And that's where we're going to start. This is another one of those summary statements. We saw this at the end of Acts chapter 2, and it sort of pans back and takes a big look at what's going on in the church and gives us this overall summary statement. And it says this is the second one. There's several of these in the book, and this is the second one. It says, all the believers were united in heart and mind, and they felt that what they owned was not their own. So they shared everything they had. The apostles testified powerfully to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's great blessing was upon them all. There was no needy people among them, because those who owned land or houses would sell them and bring the money to the apostles to give to those in need. So we have again this statement that they shared everything in common. And once again, Luke, the author, knows his Hebrew Bible really well, because we have a statement like this at the beginning of Israel's, as a nation, at its beginning. Just like we have the church beginning, we have a notice at the beginning of Israel as a nation in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15, verses 4 to 5. God speaks through Moses to the very young nation of Israel and says, there will be no needy among you. You're not going to find people that have tremendous need, because as we follow God and we are committed to God's way and God's reign over us, then these kind of things will be taken care of. And we see that with this statement happening in Luke. And so once again, Luke is showing us that the community is becoming that presence of God where people's needs are met, both practically and spiritually. Okay, so we have one of these beautiful pictures, and also this is not a commune, but it's sort of it's a radical approach to how we view material blessings. Okay, so it's not so much that everyone's bringing everything they have and put it in a pot at the apostles' feet. It's not like that. It's the idea is that as needs arise within the community, people are willing to take what they have and give it to help meet people's needs. And so they do not view their own possessions as their own. They share what they have when it's needed. Okay, so they're bringing the things that they have when it's needed and supporting one another. This is what we call fellowship, supporting one another. It is a picture of what God's reign would look like on earth. This is what, Jesus talked about the coming kingdom of heaven. This is what it looks like. This is what Peter's giving us a picture of what that looks like in very practical ways. And I'm reminded of what Jesus says, where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be also. And what you see here is that people are treasuring other people. And so that's where their heart is. They're not treasuring possessions, they're treasuring people, and so they're meeting people's needs. And this was a radical thing, and I think it was mentioned by historians for a couple hundred years. The church was characterized by this in the first, second century. And so it was just a radical group where people were taken care of. It's just a beautiful thing. But like I said before, we have a threat. Before we get to the threat, Luke's going to give us a very particular example here. He says, for instance, in particular, there was Joseph, the one the apostles nicknamed Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. So they just called this guy Encouragement. That's the name they gave him. He had his own name, but the apostles come along and says, we're gonna call you Encouragement. That's your new nickname. Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. He was from the tribe of Levi, and came from the island of Cyprus. By the way, he's from the tribe of Levi, and the Levites run the temple. So once again, we get temple language in this passage. The community is the new temple. He sold a field he owned and brought the money to the apostles. Right. So there's an example. Everyone's giving and supporting one another. Here's a specific example. Barnabas comes along, sells some property, gives it to the apostles to distribute as the community had need. Okay. But there's a big but here. There's problems that are going to arise. We're going to see a contrast in how people function in this community. Okay, so we have the beginning of Acts chapter 5, verse 1. But there was a certain man named Ananias who with his wife Sapphira sold some property. Okay, so they're doing just like Barnabas did. He brought part of the money to the disciples, claiming it was the full amount. With his wife's consent, he kept the rest. Okay, so they sell some property for X amount of dollars, and they keep some of the dollars for themselves, but they come and tell the disciples and saying, here's some money, and this is everything, but really what they did is they kept some money for themselves. So I just want to say at the outset here, this is not about, a church wouldn't launch a financial campaign on this, because it's not about the money. It's about the lying about it. It's about the deceitful words that they are using, and the way they approach community is deceitful. And you have sort of an Adam and Eve story. You have Ananias and Sapphira, and we say, what does this have to do with Adam and Eve? Well, it says that he does this with his wife's consent, and it reminded me of Eve, who takes the fruit and eats it, and it says, and her husband Adam was with her, and he ate it as well. In other words, you don't hear much about Adam, but it's very clear with the author of Genesis that Adam was a part of this. He's giving his consent in this, eating of the forbidden fruit. And here you have the same idea. Luke is drawing on that imagery and saying, he sold all this with his wife's consent. She is complicit as well. And the issue is that they are lying about it. They're not being honest with the disciples. It's not about bringing all the money. They could have kept some for themselves, but they lie about it. So how does this play out? Peter said, Ananias, why have you let Satan fill your heart? That is harsh. That is harsh. You lied to the Holy Spirit and you kept some of the money for yourself. Right? Again, the issue is not keeping the money. The issue is not keeping the money. This is not a passage about sell everything you have and give it to the church. Listen what Peter says. The property was yours to sell or not to sell, as you wished. And after selling it, the money was yours to give away. It's all your money. How could you do a thing like this? You weren't lying to us. You were lying to God. And so the issue is the lying and the deceitfulness. He's like, you could have come to us and said, I sold it for this amount of money and I'm going to give you a portion of that. But what he did is he sold it. He kept some and he said, this is all I got. This is all I got. And he lies. And so, it's funny because if the community is the temple of God, if that's the community where God dwells, then a church that is not honest with one another is not honest with God, right? If that's where the presence of God is among the people and you're lying to the people, Peter's making the connection here that you're lying to God. You're lying to the Holy Spirit. You're in the temple and you're being dishonest. And he characterizes this as Satan's work. Now, we haven't heard this kind of language since Judas, right? This is what Jesus says to Judas, or what in the Gospel of John, it says that Satan entered his heart and he betrayed Jesus. And so not only are we seeing someone just being deceitful, but there's evil forces at work, right? There's evil forces at work. And what's really interesting here is the use of speech, right? The church is born when the Spirit is poured out on the people, and they begin speaking languages that other people can hear, and they're proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. And now here, the very first time we see a trial or something, some sort of struggle within the church, it revolves around speech, and it's tied to Satan. It's tied to evil forces. And so here, this thing which threatens the community, this temple of God, this new temple, this where so many good things are happening, is speech. It's speech. And it's false speech. It's falsehood. It's lying. It's being deceitful with our words. And the thing that birthed the church was the Spirit of God showing up through speech and being able to proclaim Jesus is King in other languages. And so this is really interesting, the way this plays out. And here's where we see this shocking thing. And this is we're a little bit embarrassed to read this in the New Testament, because we think, oh, New Testament, God is different than the Old Testament God. And here we see it. As soon as Ananias heard these words, he fell to the floor and died. Everyone who heard about it was terrified. Fear gripped the community. Then some young men got up, wrapped him in a sheet, took him out, and buried him. Now, oftentimes we talk about fear as in reverence and awe of God, and there's certainly overlap with this term, but listen, this guy just dropped dead. I think they're talking about fear, like there's a fear over, there's just a sense of awe, but fear over this community with this happening. And I think all of us would feel that way if we experience something like this. Now, his wife, turns out, wasn't with him during this time. And so she shows up, right? Verse 7, about 3 hours later, his wife came in. Not knowing what happened, Peter asked her, "Was this the price you and your husband received for your land?" "Yes," she replied, "that was the price." And Peter said, "How could the two of you even think of conspiring to test the Spirit of the Lord like this? The young men who buried your husband are outside the door, and they're going to carry you out as well." Now, he's not cursing her. I think this is more of a prophetic word. He's saying this is what's going to happen. Instantly, she fell to the floor and died. 2 young men came in, saw that she was dead, carried her out, and buried her beside her husband. Great fear, again, gripped the entire church and everyone else who heard what happened. And so she comes in and she is complicit in the lies. She is complicit in the deceit. She is not being truthful. Now, this is a tough story. It's a tough story for followers of Jesus. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And here we have this story very early on in the church's history where, two people dropped dead for lying about the community. And I just want to say that this is not an unusual story, actually. We see several stories like this in the Old Testament. And I think because the Old Testament comes off as a bit more rough to us, that we kind of accept these kind of stories. But there's a lot of stories like this. For example, there's Leviticus 10, verses 1-3. We have 2 priests, Aaron's sons, who don't really follow protocol in offering incense in the temple. And when they do that, they just fall over and die. It's really interesting because it's 2 of them. They're 2 priests, and they don't really follow directions. Joshua chapter 7, we have Israel as a very young, not even a nation yet. Well, I guess a nation, but kind of a loose, a band of tribes. They're going in to conquer Canaan, Israel, what we know as Israel. They had this incredible defeat at Jericho. And one of the things that you do when you defeat is that the plunder, all the wealth, goes to God. You offer it up in a fire, and it goes up in smoke to where God is in heaven. And so they were commanded to do that. This guy Achan takes some. He takes some and he hides it in his tent. And then they go to the next town, the town of Ai, and they're not able to beat it. And Jericho is a much bigger city. They should have, if they can beat Jericho, they can beat this small town, and they're not able to do it. And they realize it's because someone was deceitful. Someone took the plunder and hid it. And when they found out, they stoned him to death and his own family. It's those kind of stories where like, really? I mean, do you really have to go that far? We have 2 Samuel chapter 6, where the ark is being brought into Jerusalem, and it comes to this point where the cart hits something in the road, and the ark starts to tip, and someone grabs out to keep it from falling, and because they touched it, he dies. He just falls over and dies. And then finally we have in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, King Uzziah is offering incense in the temple. He is a king. He is not a priest. He's not supposed to be doing that. The priests show up and say, don't do this. He says, I'm going to do it. I'm the king. And he immediately breaks out. He becomes a leper immediately. Breaks out in this untreatable sickness. And he lives that way for the rest of his life. So we read those stories and we're like, gosh, this is so harsh. This is so harsh. How can that happen? So this story is in the same vein as all of those. And what's interesting about those stories, you got to catch this. They all deal with temple or worship. All right. So Achan is the one in Joshua 7 where it doesn't have to do with temple presence, but it does have to do with something that is dedicated to God. That's something that is separate, that should be set apart for God, and Achan takes it for himself, for his own wealth, and the whole family is executed because of that. And so all of those have to do with the issue of worship, and most of them have to do with being in the temple, right? And so you have this space that is sacred. It's set apart, and it should be different. It should be different than the world that we see around us. And when it's not, there are severe consequences. And the same is true here, that the community is the place where the Spirit of God dwells. And there is a sense in which when we read this story, that vision for the community, for God's people, is a bit fragile. It's not going to take much to derail it. And luckily, God steps in and takes care of it. These people have this judgment where they just drop down and die. And I think what happens is we read that and we think, oh my God, we're shocked by it. We're shocked by how, what happens to these people, and say that's so unfair. That's not the God I know. But here's the point. Here's what I think Luke wants us to see. We should be shocked, not by the consequences, but by the fact that the people are deceitful. We should be shocked by the level of deceit. We should be shocked that we have this grace, we have this forgiveness, we have this place where the Spirit of God is moving, and we're going to treat it just like the rest of the world treats each other. This is separate space. It's supposed to look different. And I believe, I'm wondering just like, what is the marketing value for Luke to put this story in here? Why would he put that? Doesn't seem like it's drawing good favor with what God looks like. And I think that it's because Luke wants us to see that what's happening here is so important. It's so necessary for the world that it should be protected at all costs. Okay. Now the issue is, here's what's interesting. I love this. We think that God's just harsh, and if we're going to be deceitful, God's going to step in and drop us dead. Okay, so this is not prescriptive. It's not prescribing what should happen in church, but it is trying to show us the importance of the community of God and the temple and what is happening there to restore the world. We need to take it so seriously, which means this community should be honest with one another. We should be honest about our flaws. We should be honest about our shortcomings. We should be honest about the good things that are happening. We should be honest about our doubts. I love this. Don't let this part of the story escape you this morning. Peter asked Sapphira, is this what happened? This is not about someone did something bad, so we're going to just slice them down and get rid of them. He's giving her an opportunity to be honest. To be honest. This is why, small groups, women's group, men's group, floodgate, any kind of group, the groups that we happen to form within the church that aren't actually part of the church, that aren't programmed, the gatherings together. We open up and we share what our shortcomings are. We share what our fears are. We share what our doubts are. We share what our loves and our desires and our hopes are. It's called honesty, and the religious term for it is called confession. And confession is not only about bad things, it's about good things, the good things that are happening. But we open up and we share with our words. And what this story is saying is that, first of all, it's beautiful because right from the beginning, we see it's not a perfect community. We can be a part of this community. I am flawed. You all are flawed. We all have our things, but we are welcome in this community. Like, God is so powerful that this broken community is going to fulfill that mission of bringing the message to the ends of the world. We are going to see that happen by the end of the book. And it's going to happen with flawed individuals where the Spirit of God is working despite that, where the Spirit of God is fighting against the spirit of evil in this world to bring truth and honesty in a community that builds one another up. But what this is showing is that this is sacred space. Listen, folks, if we can't have a community where we're honest with one another about our shortcomings, about our fears, then we're not offering the world any sacred space. We're not offering them anything different than the local pub. Check this out. I want to read this. This is from Matthew Skinner, a commentary. Why does Acts find an Ananias and Sapphira story worth telling? Who clings to such a story with the image of a quick-tempered, no second chances for you God? Who thinks or hopes that God acts in such a way? Maybe angry people do, or threatened people, or fearful people. Not people suffering from merely any kind of fear. Maybe these particular people fear losing what is truly life-giving for them. Maybe the passage comes from people afraid of losing a community capable of embodying the best things, such as God's very own commitment to them. Those people might fear losing hope for what God can make possible for them, their loved ones, and their neighbors in need. If fear stalks this passage and the path it took to get into the New Testament, perhaps this fierce and vengeful fear nevertheless exposes how important the beautiful parts of this passage are, and how desperately we long to experience community and flourishing, like what we read about at the end of Acts chapter 4, like with Barnabas, son of encouragement. The passage reminds us how difficult it is to create such a place, given all our flaws and suspicions. When nothing comes along to make our difficult lives easier or more pleasant, we achingly want God to protect it, sometimes at any cost. What this is showing is that this community is worth protecting, and it's so important. So the challenge today is to open up and share. Time of corporate confession isn't something we do very often, but perhaps this morning or in your small groups this week, we can do that together. We can just open up. It doesn't have to be the deepest, darkest thing, although exposing light to those things is very healthy. But let's let the Spirit of God come in through our honesty with our struggles, our hopes, our fears, our desires, our shortcomings, our flaws, and our doubts, as we come together to worship God in a true community. All right, God bless. See you next week.